Welcome to Mary's Cup of Tea, the self-love podcast for women, though all self-lovers are welcome here. I'm your host, Mary Jolkowski. I'm an author, speaker, retreat leader, and all-around self-love advocate. And this is the podcast that will inspire you to love yourself. Hi, Elise. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Great pleasure and privilege.
I'm thrilled to talk to you, and I'm assuming that a lot of people clicked on this episode either A, because they really identify with the pressure to be a good girl, or they're kinky and thought it was something totally different. So,
or both. Or
all both, right? I wanted to work backwards, actually, and ask you, before we dive into the 7 deadly sins and elaborating on a couple of them, I wanted to ask you, how do you describe yourself if not good? Or better yet, what would you say your values are now that you have kind of unpacked the pressures and expectations of being a good girl? Because I'm somebody who's always strived to be good, and I can't even fathom a different word that isn't loaded with everything that you talk about stemming from the patriarchy.
Yeah, that's a great and really interesting question. And I don't know that I've come up with new language. I, just like everyone who's read the book or everyone who is listening to this conversation, I'm much more aware of the way that these ideas of goodness control my behavior and the way that I want to be seen in the world. But I'm not necessarily immune to that pressure, nor have I fully thrown myself off. But what I always come back to, and what a lot of my work has become about since writing on our best behavior, is this Carl Jung quote, "I'd rather be whole than good." And I think about that all the time. It's on a Post-it on my computer. It's this idea that perfection, it's a silly pursuit, because women, the thesis of my book is that women are conditioned for goodness while men are conditioned for power. And so for a lot of women, goodness, particularly as it's expressed in this idea of being perfect, is what we've spent most of our lives trying to achieve. Perfection isn't a real concept, but what is real is wholeness. Wholeness includes all the parts of ourselves that we've been conditioned to believe are bad, or that we've repressed or suppressed or refused to acknowledge, might be key components of who we are. And this is how it is for all humans, right? We can all proclaim our goodness, but the reality is that we all have bad days. We want things that maybe we think are unseemly or sinful. That's part of what it is to be a human.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about perfection is actually what inspired my opening question, because I think a lot of people would say, I'm a recovering perfectionist. That has been very popular. Same thing with, I say I've recovered from an eating disorder, but it still has the word in it. So I was like, if there's anybody who would know some better language, it would be you. And I love that Carl Jung quote. Wholeness.
Yeah. I'm working on my wholeness. I'm just trying to allow all parts of myself to be present and trying to get as close to myself as possible. That requires looking at the things that I would like to disavow or repress or project onto other people and make them carry for me as well. But it's ridiculous when you think about it, this idea, and we're also used to saying it, but this, I'm a good person, I'm a good friend, etc. It's as ridiculous in many ways as saying, I'm a perfect person, I'm a perfect friend. It's such a shield against our humanity and fallibility and complexity and all of the wonderful things too that we might see as bad that other people see as lovable and redeemable qualities.
I think saying I'm a whole person is probably more accurate. How did you personally come to calling this and unpacking the 7 deadly sins? And also, what are the 7 deadly sins?
Yeah, I know, right? I think people sometimes see the subtitle of the book, which is, name of the book is On Our Best Behavior, The 7 Deadly Sins and the Price Women Pay to Be Good. And they think, oh, this book is about religion or an indictment on Christianity or Catholicism. And it's not. It's a secular book. And like you, I was most familiar with the 7 Deadly Sins because of the movie Seven. When I was first started to think about writing this book, and, I really wanted to answer these big questions about, like, what is it in me that compels me toward performing myself in this idealized way as this good woman in culture? Why do I use this goodness as a shield against any sort of criticism or judgment? What's happening? And then to take it a step further, why is this what women specifically not only police in ourselves, but then police in each other? When I started to try to understand, like, what is that? Where does this come from? I started with this idea of envy, and then I was looking into envy some more, and then I realized, oh, it's one of those sins. Like, oh, what were they? And then I saw them, and I was like, oh my God, this is a punch card for what it is to be a good woman. So they are sloth, envy, pride, lust, greed, gluttony, and anger. Let me tell you how this shows up culturally. So a good woman is never tired. A good woman doesn't really have any wants. She subjugates her wants to other people's needs. Other people's needs are always the priority. A good woman doesn't really need any attention or praise or affirmation. She's content to be somewhat behind the scenes. She doesn't, attention is unseemly. A good woman has no real appetite or hunger. In fact, her body is quote unquote good and highly conditioned and the right size, and everything is in its appropriate place. A good woman doesn't talk about money. Money is base and gross and really for other people and for men. And to want more money is unseemly, definitely. A good woman definitely doesn't have any sexual appetite. She's desirable, but not desiring. She is happy to be the object, but she's not the subject of her own sexual desire. A good woman really doesn't get mad about any of this. Those are the sins. That's it. That's what it looks like. And that's what so many of us perform habitually and ritually in our daily lives. In this, like, don't look at me. I'm a really good person over here, staying in bounds with my behavior.
And we really see it highlighted by the insults that are usually driven at women. The first one that came to my mind when you started describing how the sins manifest as like attention whore, right?
Yes.
Worst thing you can be called.
Whore.
Attention whore. And
Attention whore.
it like doubles the two of the recognition and the slut shaming. Now I think the younger kids are saying pick me girl. We have the, very typical bitch, slut, mean. And
when you think with expletives for angry women, I mean, they're endless. Shrew, harpy, bitch, castigator, hysterical, witch, on and on. And the two for men, still blame it on the woman. Son of a bitch, bastard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Have you by any chance read the book Word Slut?
I haven't, which is shocking, but I have read Amanda Montell's other books, and I've had her on my podcast.
She was on the show, yeah.
Yeah, I need to read Word Slut because we have the same interest in etymology.
Yeah, the linguistics behind it is just fascinating. The one that I can never stop thinking about is when she described like even the sexual act of penetration, it's still from the male gaze. Like we don't say, I enveloped him. We say he penetrated me.
Yeah, and this stuff is so powerful. We often don't, we could go into a whole thing about words and the energy that they carry and their roots. That's a really powerful example. We don't like angry women. In fact, unless they are the only time culturally that we allow it is when they are defending patriarchy. So you have sort of the mama bear of Sarah Palin or Marjorie Taylor Greene or someone like that protecting patriarchy. if it's a woman who is seen as attacking people in power or criticizing systems or saying, do not tread on me, this is unacceptable, we have no tolerance. You can look at all the memes that we have about Black women and the angry Black woman. But really, what's interesting is the study suggests that it's white women who are the angriest. We're the ones who are the least comfortable with the expression of anger. That energy is stuck in our bodies. It has to go somewhere. You think about the amount of energy that women expend trying to repress or suppress these feelings or emotions that we have coded as bad. And you can imagine both the amount of energy that requires. Any woman, I mean, you would know, any woman going through her life and navigating a day of eating knows what it's like to spend a lot of energy restricting and controlling and obsessing over what you're eating or not eating. And same with anger. You think about the ways in which we higher mind it or just stuff it in our bodies. And that not only does it take a lot of pressure to keep that cork in the champagne bottle, but that energy is in our bodies. It's stuck.
Mm-hmm. And like generationally so, like almost in our biology at this point, I bet.
Yes.
So let's dive into the example that you said I think would be really relatable to me and a lot of our listeners with the background with disordered eating and body image. One of the 7 deadly sins you mentioned is gluttony. Could you explain why it's a sin for women? And I want to know, you posted that this was one of the hardest ones for you to write about.
Well, in some ways it was one of the easiest because it's so accessible and culturally available, because fat phobia is obviously rampant, but it's one of the few, it's still completely socially acceptable. There is no legislation. I think in one state there's legislation that you're not allowed to discriminate based on the size of someone's body. But for the most part, it is completely acceptable and still widely defended. And it seems like we were starting to have really substantive conversations about stigma and the way that we police people's bodies, particularly women. Ozempic and that whole world has, again, sort of changed the channel and what should be a simultaneous and conversation and something that we still need to address and still need to discuss. Because as we know, morality and body size are indelibly tied together in our culture. And they are established by our sort of standards of beauty and norms in this country. And then they're upheld by, the medical industry and so on and so forth. And it's such a complex Gordian knot that you walk into where people essentially feel extremely validated in their fat phobia because of issues of health. And so they, concern troll and they get into people's business and they are all over people who do not have a sort of body that abides by traditional body standards. It's crazy, actually. It's one of those things, I think, and I don't know how much time it will take, but we'll look back and say, do you remember when it was everyone felt completely comfortable commenting on the size of other people's bodies and shaming them publicly and going through their grocery carts to instruct them about what they should and shouldn't be eating? And it's one of those things too, I think, for, I write a bit about dysmorphia, but for so many, I don't really know any women who are truly free about their bodies or their eating, or have a fluid relationship with themselves where they aren't consumed with coding their choices as good or bad. Do you feel like you know any women who are, all I know now are women who are on Ozempic and are saying, I finally have relief from the food noise. But that's how intense it is.
Yeah. I would say me. I don't think about it, but I'm also privileged enough to be in a smaller body. So I wonder if that would be or I'm pretty certain it would be a more difficult journey for me if I were in a bigger body. I know our mutual friend, Cara Lowenthal, she seems pretty liberated of that. But it's definitely few and far between and so rare. I really hope that experience you described of we're going to be like, can you believe, do you remember when we were pieces of shit like that? And I hope my kids would be shocked to find that out. But I pessimistically do not see that going away anytime soon.
Yeah. It's just such an easy standard, compelling to people to feel this certainty about passing judgment on other people's bodies and choices, as though the two are necessarily that related, right? Because you were born into a smaller body. I'm very tall, but I am genetically quite thin. This isn't because I'm so excellent at going to the gym or corralling my portion size. This is largely just because I came out like this. And yet people would look at me and say, you're of higher moral value. You have more self-control. You have more discipline. You're more compliant. And these other people are taxes on culture and society. They clearly don't have any self-control. But any woman listening also knows, like, that is, and as I age, I'm learning this every day. I don't have the same, the levers that we're supposed to be able to use to control the size of our body are very evasive, particularly as you get older. You know, it's a lie. It's a lie. If my husband ate what I ate, he would be emaciated. And yet he can eat 2 pints of ice cream in front of the TV every night. You know, it's just not, we've also been sold this lie that we should, if you can abide by this basic math, calories in, calories out, that everything else should fall into order. And women, I think in particular, know that is bad math. That math does not math.
Well, let me ask you this. Yeah, the math does not math for sure. And I could be here for hours and days and weeks talking about the pervasiveness of diet culture and fat phobia. And it's where I started, I suppose, Mary's Cup of Tea. One thing that I've found in extensive research is that it seems that what we hold as the highest standard of good, like you mentioned, moral virtue in our time and place and culture right now, it's thinness. When I was writing my book, and I think most people have come to know this, that hundreds of years ago, thinness wasn't necessarily the same ideal that it was today. And so it brought up an interesting gateway to discussing access and really coming to the root of the problem, which is classism. It's whatever is least accessible to the most amount of people, or the flip side, the ideal is whatever is accessible only to a small majority that can afford perfect food and trainers and surgeries and weight loss stuff and, makeup artists and producers and everything, right? That to monitor their performance. Because now as our farming culture and thus food culture has become more industrialized, I don't know what other word to use besides healthier food is least accessible. Now the ideal is what's harder, basically.
Yeah.
So when it comes to your writing about gluttony, this is probably a tough question. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but how has that changed or evolved across time and space, for example? Because I feel like the 7 deadly sins, you mentioned that they're almost biblical in nature. There's something religious about it. So I have a feeling they've been around for a while, but maybe just in different ways. So I want to know what some of those other examples are, whether it's historically or maybe other ways we have not thought about gluttony.
Gluttony. Yeah. So let me give you a quick overview of where they came from, because this is the other shocker. They're not actually in the Bible. They came out of, which was a shocking revelation to me. I assumed, again, I didn't grow up in a religious household, so I assumed these must be a massive part of the gospel, right? Jesus
like
must
the
have
Ten
been
Commandments or
proclaiming them.
something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like they must have that same prominence. No. They came out of the 4th century, out of the Egyptian desert. There was this monk named Vagres Ponticus. He's also credited as being one of the early fathers of the Enneagram. Yeah. He was a wealthy man who was having an affair with a married woman. And so he decided to take to the desert. And he was an ascetic monk. They would stand in 4 feet of water, freezing water overnight to repent, beg for their bread every day. Or, it was very ascetic, very ascetic.
Sorry.
He wrote, yeah.
English second language. What does ascetic mean?
Just like very no pleasure, bare bones, no, like nothing soft or luxurious about any way in which they lived. So they were living sort of as paupers on a crust of bread, essentially.
Like a denial of pleasure.
All denial of pleasure. So he wrote this little chapbook, and at this time, there wasn't printing, everything was hand copied, and it was called the Practicos, and it was bits of scripture to be used against these demons, but it wasn't a demon the way that we would think of it. It was a distracting thought that would keep you out of prayer. And there were 8 that he named, and he included sadness on this list. And these are mostly the concerns of these monks, right? You can imagine Gluttony had a very different, they weren't thinking about America 1990s. They were thinking about like, let me subsist on this 5, I shouldn't want for more than like this small piece of bread. He wrote them down. They were passed around the desert. And then it was in 590 AD that Pope Gregory, I don't know how many people who listen know about Mary Magdalene. I love Mary Magdalene and know about her gospel. But this is in 590, the same homily where Pope Gregory conflates Mary Magdalene with the woman who anoints Jesus's feet with her hair, different woman. But he says this is the same woman, and this woman is a penitent prostitute, Mary Magdalene. She is the carrier of these 7 cardinal vices. And he names the 7 sins. He drops sadness, which I include in my list. That's when Mary Magdalene, besides Mother Mary, the most famous person in the New Testament, the rightful first apostle, Jesus resurrects to her and gives her his first teaching. She becomes a prostitute. A reputation that she carried until the 1980s when the papacy said, oops, she wasn't really a whore. And then it was in 2014 or 2016 that Pope Francis said she's the apostle to the apostles. But as we know from reputational harm to women, those stories die a slow death. So in most people's minds, Mary Magdalene is a penitent prostitute and the carrier of all this sin, much like Eve, right? But yeah, so gluttony originally was this like admonishment against complete overindulgence. It had nothing to do with beauty standards. It had nothing to do, didn't prescribe certain body sizes. It was just this like, and it was widely used as this invective against eating too much, drinking too much, taking all instances of like too much life. That's the way would have been originally conceived, but now obviously it has its own life that's very tied to body size and has actually nothing really to do with what might actually be on your plate.
It's like a proxy for wanting more of anything. When you said Mary Magdalene becomes a prostitute, to clarify, she was never a prostitute.
No.
She got mixed up.
And there was no prostitute. He just kind of made it up wholesale and then said she was a prostitute. And there's this scene, again, not to do Bible Studies 101, but there's a statement when Jesus is resurrecting. And again, this isn't about what you believe. This is just what's in the Bible. He's resurrecting. He resurrects to Mary Magdalene. He appears to her as the gardener. She realizes it's him. He gives her this beautiful teaching, which becomes her gospel, which is deemed heretical and tossed out and not recovered until the 80s. Cue Dan Brown and not the Da Vinci Code and all of that. He says to her, "Noli me tangere," which means don't cling to me. The way that feminist or more modern theologians interpret that is like, I am still in the process of like I'm in my process of ascending or going in. And so like, you can't come with me. But the way that that was interpreted at the time and then painted, because Pope Gregory I, the same Pope, also there used to be an edict on iconography because of the Ten Commandments. And he lifted that as well. So there was this this huge amount of religious art that was painted. And she was painted on her knees, clinging to him, dressed in red as the penitent prostitute. So that's also why it's really become cemented in our minds, this like whore tugging at Jesus, who is saying like, don't touch me. Don't touch me, you whore. That's the way that it was interpreted.
But what he was really saying was, you can't come with me?
Yeah. You have to let me go. I'm still sort of in process, sort of a mediumistic vision of like, you are apprehending me. You have the sight to see my etheric body or whatever is happening, but you can't come. I'm not really materially, physically here. You can't cling to me.
I love Bible studies 101. One thing most people don't know about me is I grew up very atheist and religious at the same time. Long story.
It sounds like a fascinating story.
I've had to read the Bible front to back in Russian multiple times. So a lot of these stories are baked into my psyche. But of course, when I say the Bible, I don't mean like the full Bible. I mean, not a kid's version, but I had this like in-between version where it was maybe half the size of a Bible with some of those illustrations that you described. So it's like baked into my psyche, but from the perspective of Russian Orthodox people who would create such a translation, and then my father who would make me read it. But anyway, this is...
And translation is everything. That's what's also so wild. And this is how culture is passed down to us, right? We just we take it in and we don't know where it came from, and we're not reading the source material. And actually, when it comes to the Bible, there is no source, right? This was written down hundreds of years after Jesus supposedly lived and died. He didn't write. Then it's been copied translated into various languages, from Aramaic to Coptic to Greek to English. I love when people think that Jesus spoke English, spoke Aramaic. Or
that he was white.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can imagine how many translation errors were introduced, people's own preferences were introduced.
Oh, totally. It's so fun. My husband knows Russian, but he's like less fluent than me when it comes to ideas, for example. So the things he hears are quite literal. And then I have to be like, no, your mom didn't mean it like that. It was a joke that actually means this. Well, let me ask you this. Out of the 7 deadly sins, sloth, envy, pride, gluttony, greed, lust, anger. You're probably so impressed being like, how'd she memorize this?
Impressed.
I'm reading from my notes.
Okay.
Which one do you feel is, and maybe we already answered this with the gluttony, but which one do you feel is most defended, or maybe more accurately, most reprimanded in our culture? I think we talked about gluttony because fat phobia is so alive and real and frequently justified in a plethora of ways. My gut also kind of says sloth because of capitalism in the modern Western world. So which one do you find is like most reprimanded? And then I think the flip side of that question answer is most useful for us to unpack or lean into if we're talking about how to stop being a good girl and maybe be a little bit more of a bad girl.
Yeah. Lust is also very easy to police and see. These are the most visible ones. Sloth, as you mentioned, is highly capitalistic, highly attached to, again, the servicing of other people's needs and the expectation that women are going to show up everywhere all the time at full speed. And the ways in which this is internalized is really deep and dark. The way that we constantly feel like we're just not doing enough, whether it's for our families or our partners or at work. We're in a terrible double bind. But I think that the two that are, I think pride is incredibly policed in our culture in very, very stealth ways, but ways that affect all of us in a way that we wouldn't necessarily recognize. And then it goes very closely hand in hand with envy, which is the one that I spend the most time talking to women about because it is deeply unconscious. And I think envy is at the root of so much of our woman on woman hate and our inability to really get behind each other, I think is because of our undiagnosed and projected envy. And they're very connected. Yeah.
I'd love to dive into that because I think when you say that, my first instinct is like, I'm not really a jealous person. I'm a girl's girl. But you mentioned that these 7 sins are used as, I think you called it a shield. And I think simultaneously a weapon, right? When we project.
Yes. And they're not, it's not conscious. So we go right into that. I don't have that. That's not me. I hear that all the time from people who read the book where they get to a chapter and they say, I don't know if I need to read this chapter. I don't think I have a problem with this. And then they read it and they have this, oh, that's me. I'm going to talk about pride very briefly and then sort of segue into its relationship to envy. And they're also related to greed and scarcity. And I'll explain why too. Pride, similar to the other ones, had a different definition back in the day with Evagrius Ponticus. It was this idea that you didn't need God. Now we punish it or police it as this sort of, you could call it the tall poppy syndrome, right? Any woman who dares to be seen, celebrated, or publicly lauded as being exceptional is pretty much ripe for a takedown or guaranteed to be, quote unquote, put back in her place. And we see this in every category. Our most visible women, we tolerate them getting some attention, and we often celebrate them as they're on the ascent, and then they reach a certain point where we decide collectively that they've had enough, and we, like a collective unconscious mob, destroy these women. Typically with reputational harm. She's a bad person. I heard she's really a bitch. Oh, I heard she's really mean to people who work for her, whether it's female founders, whether it's actors, musicians. The only person, there are some sort of wizened actors who know to get out of the public spotlight and hide. And then you only really see them when they come out to promote a movie, and then they go away and they very much stay in a box and stay in their lane. But really one of the only women who I can think of who has endured is Taylor Swift. And I think that it's because she has an army of fans who know what's up and recognize the pattern. And I know they can be really aggressive, and so rightly or wrongly, but they will go after anyone who attempts to start any let's put Taylor Swift back in her place movement. So that's a really interesting example of people who are, whether they're conscious of it or not, are saying like, not today. No, you will not touch her. She stays exactly where she is on the pedestal on which we have placed her. But for the most part, I write at the beginning of the chapter about Anne Hathaway and Jennifer Lawrence and the Academy Awards when Anne Hathaway was in the process of being torn down and destroyed, and Jennifer Lawrence was on her way up, and she could do nothing wrong, and everyone thought she was so funny, and oh, look at her like tripping down the stairs, and she's so real and authentic. And then of course it wasn't that much longer. I mean, she's not on social media. Jennifer Lawrence isn't, because everyone went for her too. So this is a cycle that we recognize in culture, and we say like, oh, who cares, they're famous, they kind of deserve it. But the reality is it's a playbook for all of us in our own lives. And this is happening in micro scales in our own communities all the time.
All the time. And on the macro, it prevents women from being in power. I mean, one of our presidential candidates, it's the same thing they did to Clinton.
Yep.
I can think of so many examples. Of course, cancel culture is so real amongst influencers who are mainly female. Is that a coincidence?
Nope.
I think not.
And it's enough. It's enough for women to say she's a bad person. For her, typically, to be like, I'm a terrible person. I'm going to go away. I will just take myself out. And we watch it happen all the time. It's just this like unconscious mob activity. And we don't have many visible women. And so to lose even one of them is a shame. And I'm not saying that you aren't allowed to criticize people's behavior, and you aren't allowed to point out where they've fallen short of their own expressed ideals or when they're maybe out of step with their integrity, but to not have a restorative process or to allow anyone to say, I'm sorry. But mostly this is happening without any infraction. Anne Hathaway, there were these Hatha haters. She was so earnest. She was such a tryhard. She's such a dork. When she got her Academy Award, she held it like a baby and said, dreams come true. What a loser. Whatever it may be. It's wild when you actually unpack it and go into allegations. Meanwhile, it's the men. Diddy gets arrested and his streaming is up 20%. Harvey Weinstein, if he weren't so close to the end of his life and fully locked up, would absolutely still be making movies. These men it doesn't matter. They don't even, they gain followers through accusations.
We won't
and they
talk about
certainly
Don.
don't go away. Yeah. No one asks for their heads on a pike. No one. No one expects them to go away. So that's pride. And it's something that I know we're somewhat conscious of, but I really wanted to try to point out how obvious this mechanism is, and then how good it feels to participate in this schadenfreude, or in this sort of, oh, she's getting what she deserves. Oh, this like feels good, right? When I watch something bad happen to this woman, how dare she lead such a big life? How dare she be celebrated? And that's where it comes into envy. And envy was really the gateway to this book, because I was talking to this psychotherapist named Lori Gottlieb, who wrote this book called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which is a great book.
Literally one of my favorite books. My
Such a
husband
good
got
book.
COVID really early on, so it was like a scary, terrible time. And her book just like got me through.
Got
Her
you
voice
through.
in my
Such a
ears.
great book.
Yes.
Yeah. So she has this very small aside in her book. It's not one of the themes, about how with her clients, she tells them to pay attention to their envy because it shows them what they want. And when I read that, I was like, whoa, because I had two thoughts. One, what you had said previously, I don't have any envy. That is not me.
I'm a girl's girl.
Which was interesting. I observed that in myself, that immediate reaction. And then the second revelation was, I don't know what I want. And then I realized, I sat with it for months and just started to study what was happening around me. And I was like, oh, I wonder if we go after these women, for example, because we're envious. Is that what's behind the attacks on Hillary Clinton, which were often, and you hear this with Kamala too, it's like, I just don't care. I feel like she's just vague, whatever it is. Never really any indictment of any specific policy or behavior or moment. Nothing. I didn't like when she did this very specific thing that bothered me. It's always a personal attack. I don't like her. She rubs me the wrong way.
Don't like her laugh.
Yeah, don't like her laugh. And what it really says is, who does she think she is? Why her and not me? And typically it's a sign of envy. She has something or is doing something that I want for myself. And it could be very small. I'm not suggesting that everyone wants to be president, but it might be, how dare she stand up on that stage and laugh? I would never, it can be very micro. But often if we're criticizing or judging someone else, and we're doing it we're triggered, we're bothered. We're not just observing it as, oh, that was kind of a funny or a weird thing to do. When it's under our skin, there's always information for us that someone is holding up a mirror and showing us something that we don't want to accept about ourselves. And so for a lot of women, it is actually envy. Why her and not me? And when we see it in our daily lives, and it's easy to find it once you start paying attention, when you're picking up your kid at school, when you're in line at the grocery store and you find yourself judging or criticizing another woman, she might be pushing on a dream that you have for yourself. She might be showing you something that you wish you had. And instead of letting that uncomfortable, quote unquote, bad feeling come up, you are projecting it. You're just not allowing it. Again, going to this idea of wholeness, you're not letting yourself feel your feelings or experience yourself as a whole person.
Could I add something as somebody who like you said, I was the stereotypical, I don't feel jealous, I'm not envious. I think I could pretty honestly say that because I've spent so much time unpacking this, I refrain from criticizing women. But one important thing to highlight is that these days, even if you're not like outspokenly criticizing someone or outspokenly like catching yourself judging the woman at the grocery store, or how a mom parents her kids, or how a female person in power is showing up, I think it's important to pay attention what kind of content we consume and what kind of conversations do we allow around us. Because I won't be the one making a video about how terrible Amber Heard is, but I'm watching it. Or I won't be the one that hates Harris's laugh. I think it's adorable and sweet and amazing. But yet when I scroll by something talking about somebody who doesn't like her, for some reason, it draws me in. And I just want to highlight to our listeners, because our listeners are just the most amazing women, and I know that for a fact, but in attempts to like challenge just a little bit in case there's somebody listening thinking that's not me. The word you used was, did you say insidious or stealth?
Yeah, it's stealth. And this is why it's really important to recognize it, not out of the pursuit of goodness, but because it's full of information for you. It's holding your wants. It's holding the dreams that you have for yourself that you might not be able to recognize. I find when I do work with women, that many women can't even say I want. They say I would like, or I want this for my kid. You know, they're triangulating all over the place because they don't know what they want, nor do they feel like they deserve it or that they can hold it. And so when you miss the cue from your soul, you're missing gold. You're missing vital information. And to your point, I think a lot of people say, like, I'm going to stuff it. I'm not going to judge. I'm not that person. But they might be experiencing it or getting it out in covert ways. Let it come out. It's really important. And for me, it looks like one of the reasons that I decided to write the book and stop ghostwriting, I'd ghostwritten 12 books, is because I noticed that I was being highly judgmental about other women's books. I didn't really think it was that good. Why do people think she's so great? I don't understand why that's, a #1 New York Times bestseller. And the minute I sort of had access to this as a conscious process, I was like, oh, Elise, you want to write a book. You want to write a book. This is your soul saying, I want that. I want that. And this is where it gets very close to greed and scarcity, because scarcity is very real for women. And partly it's because it's a story that we have, and so we perpetuate it. But when we look around, we say, oh, there's really only 1 or 2 women on that executive team or on that board. We've never had a female president, so on and so forth. We see it all over the place, confirming that we're right to feel like it's really only going to be one of us. When we see someone who has something that we want, or is doing something that we want, who has a top-rated podcast or a really vibrant career at a law firm, whatever it is, our instinct then is to say, if she has it, I can't have it too. I need to destroy her in order to make this available for me. There's not enough for all of us. These things all get going together. They're overlapping simultaneously in our minds. But the more you can pay attention and just let it sit. Because I had this experience with my editor. She was like, I don't believe this. I don't have any envy. I'm like, the way that you're holding that right now suggests like you are envious as fuck. And sure enough, a couple months later, she was ready to sort of unload everything that she had observed in herself. I was sitting with a friend when I was writing this chapter, and I was explaining it to her, and her mom was nearby, and she was like, oh, I don't have any envy. You grew out of that. And my friend was like, I don't have any envy at all. And I said, okay, sure. Next day, I get 10, 12, 14 text messages. I thought something was dramatically wrong with one of my kids. And I pick it up, and it's my friend. And she's like, I hate this mom and this woman. And they were all these creatively expressed moms in LA who all have brands. And she was like, blah, 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 on and on and on. She's like, okay, I found it. I get it. I know. I know. I want a brand, and I want to be a stylist and all of these things. I get it.
Envy shows us what we want.
Yes. And this is important. You are allowed to criticize other women, but you will find it has a very different temperature, and it is not personal when you are saying, I really don't like how she speaks to coworkers, and like it makes me really uncomfortable, and I at times feel like I need to step in. Or like I look at someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm not envious of Marjorie Taylor Greene. She inspires actually nothing in me. There's no provocation of emotion or feeling. But I can tell you a lot of the things that she does that I vehemently disagree with and do not like, in the ways in which I feel like she's unkind and cruel to other people. I can point to all those behaviors in the world and say, I don't like that. I'm not okay with that. But I'm not envious of her. So I hope that that's clear. Because sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, there are people I don't like. I don't think I want to be them.
How do you feel the difference? You said it's a different temperature.
It just I feel it in my body. You'll just know when you're sort of like searching for you're just like, I need to deprecate her. It has like an edge, a nastiness. It doesn't feel very good. And that's when you know you're in the presence of your envy. And instead of stuffing it, just like let it come up. Just be like, oh, this is so interesting. What's happening here? What is this person doing that I wouldn't allow myself to do? And sometimes it's like very subtle. It is, God, I wish I were like that relaxed. I wish I would allow myself to care so little about my own appearance. Or alternately, I wish I felt better about my body and felt comfortable wearing crop tops and short shorts at 45. I don't. It's a good one. It's so full of information.
You have some amazing reviews of your book. I was snooping. I'll just say it like it is. I was snooping. And it's thrilling and delightful as a religious person drop out with some complicated feelings about that. I selfishly love that you've mentioned at the beginning that people sometimes assume that your book is somehow religious because of its subtitle. And there was one review. It's not a negative one. It's actually a really good one. And I love the way it ended. I want to read it to people in case they're not yet convinced to get your book, because I have it on Kindle, but it doesn't feel sufficient. So I think I need a hard copy to be able to properly annotate. And this one says, in the first chapter, Elise realizes after a hyperventilating episode that lands her in an intense therapy session that she's been trying to be a good girl her whole life. She's been running herself ragged, caring dutifully for her family, friends, and colleagues, punishing her body to stay a certain size, and keeping her temper in check. This life crisis thrusted her to ask, what if I just stopped? Thus began her excavating expedition through history, discovering that goodness and acceptability were conjoined for women, not men. She pit-stopped at her childhood to trace what that programming first caught in her in the jaws of that oppressive agenda. Even as a self-proclaimed white, cis, heterosexual, upper-middle-class, agnostic spiritual, she still felt prisoner of these Judeo-Christian ideas of goodness. I really love that sentence. I know, I don't know. I know blurbs are supposed to be from famous people, but I just kind of want that on the back of your book. And I wanted to read that to really encourage people to get it, because you said there's so many interconnected themes, and I love the discussion of both, you know, the blending of linguistics and the going back to biblical times and history and where this all stems from and ties together in our current modern world that is still mean to women.
It is. God. I mean, we've made some progress. I honestly feel like now that not all, but so many, and this is also why I really wanted to write the book, because I looked around and I recognized that whoever's adjudicating our system is potentially restricting the way that we live our lives, and women are obviously losing rights right now, which is terrifying, as are other Americans. It wasn't such a simple story as what I had been told, where men equal bad and women equal victim, right? It's not that simple. And what I really wanted to address also was my own internalized patriarchy and the ways in which we and other women are keeping the system alive by perpetuating it on ourselves and on each other. If we could resolve that in ourselves and really get behind each other and become far more conscious about what's operating in us and these stories that we're just taking on wholesale as our own, but we don't really know where they came from, I think we could actually make really rapid progress, because I don't think that there are that many men standing in our way. And I think if we could really put our own sort of quote unquote bad feelings to bed, that we could really change things for all of us really fast.
Would you say this process has given you deeper self-love?
Oh, yeah. Deeper self-love and self-acceptance. And honestly, it's been really fun and very interesting. And I didn't initially intend to put myself in the book. I sold this book as, prescriptive nonfiction, where I was going to analyze society and do all the research. And then my editor insisted that I put myself in there and do the work myself as a proxy for the reader. And this is what it is to actually engage with all of these sins in a very real, I'm not that exceptional, I'm just like everyone else way. So that people are like, oh, this is all of us. So many of these things that we thought were just us or just our family of origin, they're culture. They're way bigger than us, and they need to be solved at that level.
I think you're really fun and interesting, and I really, really appreciated this conversation.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.